So, Emily, you can just put this in the chat, I guess, since you're muted, but like, can people, like, if people start logging in now, like, they'll hear us talking?
Correct.
Okay. I'm gonna mute myself then. Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining. We're going to give folks a minute or two to tune in and then we'll get started. So just sit tight. Hi, all. For those who are just joining, we are giving folks one more minute to log on and then we will get started. Thanks for your patience. All right, let's get going. Hi, everyone. I'm Jordana Lewis. I am the Associate Director of Communications for Ocean Conservancy's Ocean Plastics Program. By way of the briefest scene setting, anyone who follows, or in your all's case, produces environmental news coverage knows that public and government scrutiny of plastics and plastics recycling has grown tremendously over the last few years. Several major news outlets around the world, including NPR, Reuters, Bloomberg, and ABC News, just to name a few, have run investigations into the effectiveness of plastics recycling efforts. At the same time, and in some cases as a response, the fossil fuel and related petrochemical industries are doubling down on efforts to sell chemical recycling, sometimes called advanced recycling, as a solution to the twin plastic pollution and recycling crises. We decided to schedule this call because we suspected it would be helpful for members of the media to learn more about chemical recycling, the science of it, and the policy implications, and to have the opportunity to ask questions from experts. So on that note, a few housekeeping items. First, this discussion is being recorded and live streamed to Ocean Conservancy's YouTube channel. Second, and relatedly, panelists have encouraged me to remind you that some of this material is fairly technical, possibly confusing. There are no dumb questions. This is the time. That said, if you'd prefer to send in a question anonymously, you can message it to me in the chat and I will do my best to work it into the queue. Third, you've probably noticed that we are short one of our panelists, Jessica Roff from Gaia. Unfortunately, she had a personal matter come up. We are confident that the other panelists can cover a lot of the content she was going to address. However, we will provide her contact information at the end of the webinar if folks want to reach out for separate one-on-one conversations. And lastly, to preview the run of show, I will introduce the panelists. We'll hear brief presentations from both. I'll then kick us off with a few questions to get the conversation started, and then open it to the audience for Q&A for the last 30 minutes or perhaps even more. All right. So with that, let me first introduce the panelists. Dr. Anya Brandon is Ocean Conservancy's Associate Director of U.S. Plastics Policy, working to advance policy at the state and federal level to eliminate plastic pollution. Anya was part of the team of environmental advocates that helped draft and pass the strongest plastics legislation in the country, SB 54 in California last year. She has a PhD in environmental engineering from Stanford University, where she studied novel ways of breaking down plastics. And prior to joining Ocean Conservancy, she served in the office of US Senator Jeff Merkley as the lead policy advisor on issues including plastics, oceans, and water. Lynn Hoffman is a co-president of Eureka Recycling, a 501c3 nonprofit social enterprise with a zero waste mission based in the Twin Cities of Minnesota. She is also the national coordinator for the Alliance of Mission-Based Recyclers, or AMBR. From congressional testimony to community-based projects, Lynn has spent the last 20 years working with grassroots organizations, companies, and governments to advise on and implement authentic recycling, plastics reduction, and zero waste policy and program solutions. So with that, Lynn, please take it away.
Thanks, Jordana. Let's see, Anya, I think you've got there we go, thanks. Yeah, just a quick note about AMBER, the Alliance of Mission-Based Recyclers. So as a coalition, we are all zero waste organizations and advocates who are running the daily ops. So that picture you see there is Eureka Recycling's truck and MRF. MRF is a material recovery facility. So we process about 400 tons a day of residential recycling, including some plastics. And we'll talk more about that. I think we use our view from the pile, as we call it, to really truth test solutions and strategies. And I think I'll start today by getting us grounded in what's happening now. Might be a little bit boring for some of you who are tracking this issue more in depth, but I'll start with a bit of a 101 on recycling and plastics recycling in particular before Anya takes a deeper dive into chemical recycling. Next slide is great. Thanks. So it's important, of course, to start with why recycle. We think of recycling as a waste reduction strategy. When we think about the end of life of that particular thing, I think what is invisible to a lot of us is everything it took to get that product or packaging to our home. So not just what happens to that packaging when it's burned or buried, but everything that it was created, all of the waste and toxics and impacts that were created upstream need to happen again unless that object is reused. I think that recycling prevents a lot of that upstream, but recycling is not impact free. It takes a lot of energy, it takes a lot of water, certainly doesn't remove toxics. And so, recycling mitigates harm of waste and extraction, but not as much, of course, as reuse, and certainly reduction is our primary strategy. But in the meantime, recycling and making sure that we're recycling well and that we are tracking the right metrics to make sure that we're actually improving human and environmental health through this initiative is really critical. Next slide. So I think it's always good to start with what makes something recyclable. What does it mean? What is recycling? How do we know if we put something in the bin, something good's going to happen to it? So for anything to be technically recyclable, it has to really tick all 4 of these gates. It's got to have end markets, meaning there are folks in the supply chain who want to buy this material to make new products, right? Because recyclers are really manufacturers. We're just creating commodities to sell back into the supply chain, and we're using discards to do that. So there has to be not just one person making a tchotchke in a basement somewhere, but like multiple transparent, responsible markets who want to buy that material. They have to also want to buy it at a cost that makes sense and that covers the cost of collecting and sorting. And then you have to be able to sort it, right? So sortability is key. In the existing system, either you need to collect it separate, drop-offs, that kind of thing, or if it's coming through a material recovery facility, which is most of the recycling coming out of residents and businesses in the US, it has to be able to be sorted with like kinds at an efficient, in an efficient manner and cost-effective manner and safe manner. So, and then finally, we have to be able to collect enough of it. It has to be convenient for consumers to get it to the right place. There has to be equitable access to everyone. And also we have to be able to collect a critical volume of the type of material that we need to aggregate to create that commodity. So all 4 of these things have to be true. Anything really technically could be recycled if we invested enough money and resources and regulation to change all of these to be positive, right? We could support and develop end markets for materials that don't have them now. All of these things are solvable. But I think the critical piece for our discussion today is on the next slide, which is also important questions about, even if we can, should we be? And this really gets to our priorities first, about where are we spending our limited time and resources to address this really urgent issue of consumption and extraction and climate instability. And some of these, every product and every brand has an incentive to be able to call their product recyclable. And lots of them are willing to put a lot of money into making that so. But just because we can put a lot of money into making something technically recyclable, there are likely other issues to ask about whether or not we should. So, for example, expanded polystyrene, styrofoam cups. There are a few markets you technically can make them into new products. There are drop-offs. It doesn't work in a recycling facility, but there are places to take it to get it recycled. It's a highly toxic material. There are ready alternatives. The impacts of making it, recycling it, disposing of it are all really problematic. And so really, if we're thinking about if we had to choose where to put our money and our time, is making styrofoam recyclable the best bet? Whereas, PET bottles, number one, soda and water bottles, we know how to recycle those. They work in the system. We certainly have too many of them and need to work on reduction. But in the meantime, those are one of the few plastics that work in the system, and we're only capturing about 20%. And so if we're going to invest time in policy, excuse me, it's much lower hanging fruit. And while all plastic has toxicity issues, all plastic has is problematic in a lot of ways. Certainly some are worse than others, and styrofoam is among the worst, as a small example. Next slide, please. So again, there's really only a few formats currently of single-use plastic packaging that are candidates for recycling in the MRF-based residential systems that we have set up in the US now. These are 1s, 2s, and 5s. In our community, they do this like I love you sign, 1, 2s, and 5s to remember. So number one, and really only bottles and some containers, like strawberry containers. So we're talking about PET number 1, HDPE number 2, and in some regions, polypropylene, which is like a yogurt tub or a lid. What's happening to all of these now is that they're currently mechanically recycled. So they get dropped off at our facility, we sort them into like kinds, and we're selling them to processors. Next slide, Anya. Where they're mechanically recycled, sometimes through a variety of stops, not always all in one shop. But what's important about defining mechanical recycling is it tells us what chemical recycling is not, right? So mechanical recycling right now, it does not change the molecular structure of the plastics before it can be used in other plastic materials. It may use chemicals and solvents to de-ink or that kind of thing. But in general, they're washed, they're flaked, and then cleaned up and melted back into pellets to use in manufacturing. So now it certainly needs, that's okay, that's fine, needs innovation. Mechanical recycling is not problem-free. Melting these plastics at low temperatures creates toxic emissions. Melting at high temperatures, they burn, of course, because they're made of petroleum. There's microplastics in wash water. There's all kinds of things that need improvement, certainly, and we need innovation. But I think that the point is that recycling in general is not a viable or effective solution for the majority of plastics. It's even the majority of single-use plastic packaging. And as we're looking at investments, policies, innovations, and expansions of recycling, really the metric we should be looking for is not whether it's possible or even economic, but is it demonstrating improvements in labor standards and safety and environmental outcomes and in human health impacts? Just kind of the baseline to set for all the varieties of chemical recycling that we'd like to talk about today. Thanks, Anya. It's to you.
Thanks, Lynn. So really quickly, I want to take a mini step back and just, why is Ocean Conservancy talking to you about this? Why is Ocean Conservancy, do we think a lot about recycling and chemical recycling? And probably most of you know this, but the ocean really has been ground zero for the plastic pollution crisis, to the tune of nearly 11 million metric tons of plastic entering our ocean each and every year from land-based sources alone. And we know that many of the same plastics that are ending up in our ocean year after year are also the same plastics that are polluting our waste stream. And while we absolutely cannot recycle our way out of this crisis, we do know that to better manage the plastics we are making and using, we need recycling to work better than it currently is. And especially to reduce pollution and as a bridge to getting towards building out a reuse and alternative systems. So putting this all into context, kind of with what we just heard from Lynn, we know that our current recycling system is falling short. by any stretch of the imagination. Globally, less than 9 plastics have been recycled. In the US, I think numbers, depending on which source and how you're, what the numerator and denominator is in terms of what you're looking at, we're between 5 and 9% of plastics are ending up getting recycled on average. And if we look at what some of these big picture problems are, I have this image here on the right, which is supposed to be our vision of the circular economy, right? Material comes in, is used by brands and retailers to then sell to consumers. It's collected, it goes to a MRF like the one that Lynn operates, which then sorts like with like, gets sent to a reclaimer to be reused, right? But we can see from this image that there are some major bottlenecks here, which is keeping us from reaching that dream circular economy. And one of these bottlenecks is collection. Only 73% of American households have access to curbside recycling. A little bit over half have automatic access. The others have to, sign up or prescribe. And that's not including multifamily or public places. So we have a real bottleneck in terms of just collecting recyclables. We also have an absolute surge of single-use plastics that are not designed or required to be recyclable in the first place. This leads to high rates of contamination in the MRF and in the resulting bales that come out of the MRF that lead to really low quality and quantity of recycling. Polystyrene, which Lynn talked about already, is a great example of this. You do not want to see what happens when an expanded polystyrene clamshell goes into some of the equipment in MRFs around the country. And we know that about half, just under half, about 40% of all of the plastic we're making every single year is for packaging, which is often used just one single time and then discarded, where it ends up in the recycling system or other end-of-life options that we'll talk about. Nearly half of all the plastics ever made have been made in the last 20 years. So this is a real exponential increase in the total amount of plastics that we're talking about. And of course, as a nation, we have a disparate and underfunded recycling system. There are nearly 10,000 separate recycling systems nationwide, which makes it incredibly confusing to figure out what and where you can recycle. So if I was to sum all that up, which is a lot of information, plastics recycling isn't working because we are collecting too little, and what we are collecting is not designed to be recyclable in the first place, among many other issues. But really, if we were just going to say, what is keeping plastics recycling from working right now, keep that in mind as we talk through some of these other technologies today. So really high level, this is the plastics life cycle. Plastics are made from fossil fuels like oil and natural gas. They are a hydrocarbon. These fossil fuels are then further processed with a lot of energy through a process called cracking and distillation, in which you get to monomers, or these basic building blocks of chemicals, things like ethane or ethylene. These monomers are then strung together in a process called polymerization, which also uses heat and energy and solvents and metal catalysts. And you see we go from these little beads to a little friendship bracelet all strung together. So now we have a polymer. These polymers are then processed into resin pellets, very much like the ones that Lynn showed earlier that come out of a processor at the end of recycling. These little plastic resin pellets are sometimes called nurdles. These nurdles are then what's sent around the country to manufacturers to turn into the plastic products we use every day. These resin pellets are melted down and used in injection molding or blow molding or whatever equipment you're using to make your plastics. This point in the chain right here is also where we see thousands and thousands of different chemicals being added into plastics to give them some of those desired qualities, whether it's durability, color, flame retardant properties. This all happens up here in this cycle. And then, of course, when we are done with our plastic products, we have the end of life. So today we're going to focus on some different options for end of life of plastics. So the absolute best case is we reuse that product. That means we can take it back and use it for the exact same thing over and over again. There is almost None of this happening in the country on real, like it's a de minimis scale in terms of the amount of plastics that we make and use. And it requires systems level change to really get and build out the infrastructure needed for sustainable reuse. So what does happen to most of our plastics? Well, they end up getting landfilled. About 75% of all of the plastics are landfilled, according to recent EPA data, where they get buried underground along with the rest of our waste. If they are not getting buried underground, they end up getting burned through energy recovery and incineration. Right now, according to the latest EPA data, we incinerate twice as much plastics in the US as we mechanically recycle. So pretty stark numbers there. Then there is the mechanical recycling process that Lynn discussed. So that's taking our plastic product all the way back to these resin pellets where they can then be reused in manufacturing to turn into a plastic product. And then there's really what we're here to talk about today, which is chemical recycling. Chemical recycling is an umbrella term that captures a suite of disparate technologies. These technologies can be broadly lumped into three big categories that we're going to talk through: purification, depolymerization, and conversion technologies. Before we talk about each of these in specifics, it is worth mentioning that these terms are constantly changing. It's chemical recycling, advanced recycling, molecular recycling, renewal technologies, different companies all use different terms. And really these terms can be obscuring of what they're really doing and the technologies behind them. So we're using chemical recycling technology today because that's kind of the most commonly used term. So the first one that we see here is purification. So this is a process that uses solvents, so chemicals and or heat, to dissolve the plastic and separate it out from additives and other things within that plastic. And you can recover that plastic without changing the basic molecular structure. So as you see here, you dissolve plastic in a solvent, you go through a series of wash and filter cycles, and then you precipitate out that plastic, dry it, and reprocess it into plastic pellets. To use this type of technology, you need highly pure feedstocks. That means you need pretty clean bales coming in from the MRFs. And it's only limited to a potential subset of plastics, as you see here. That gets us back to this plastic polymer. The next technology is depolymerization, which is a fairly broad category. In and of itself, you can use solvents, heat, and catalysts to break apart the plastics into monomers. You can also use enzymes or biotic degradation, which is what I used to study, to do the same thing. Essentially, you whatever system you're using, whether it's solvents or biotic, you break that plastic apart into its substituent monomers. So you're going back to those little beads if we're thinking about our friendship bracelet. Again, you need pretty pure feedstocks to do this. Oops, I'm sorry. And it's also limited to a very specific type of plastics called condensation polymers. And this is a class of polymers that's made up from two different monomers. And the polymerization reaction to create that plastic enables this specific type of depolymerization. So this is not applicable to all types of plastics. And the last one, which is the real big one that we talk about most, is conversion technologies. There's two main types of conversion technologies. These are the technologies that are really most talked about in the build out of chemical recycling in the United States and around the world. The first of these, as you're seeing here, is pyrolysis. This uses high heat and pressure to break apart those chemical bonds in plastic into shorter chain hydrocarbons, liquid and gases. When we're talking about high heat, we're talking about the order of 600 degrees Fahrenheit up to 1600 degrees Fahrenheit. So really, really high heat, a lot of energy to break down those bonds in the plastic. The result is a pyrolysis oil, which is really a mixture of a bunch of different types of short chain hydrocarbons. So you see there's some syngas that's generated, which is like methane, hydrogen, carbon monoxide, and then a bunch of really crude oils. The second of those two conversion technologies is gasification. This is another process that uses heat and pressure to break up those chemical bonds in the plastic. When we're talking about high heat here, we really mean about 1,000 to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. So incredibly energy intensive process. And you produce largely synthetic natural gas at the end. So a combination of carbon monoxide, methane, hydrogen, and carbon dioxide. A lot of that is used for energy for the process itself, and then the rest, much like the pyrolysis oil, is shipped off for use in energy other places. As I just mentioned, both of these processes use a ton of heat, which has a lot of greenhouse gas emissions effects. So these conversion chemical recycling technologies have much larger climate footprints than our mechanical recycling comparison. Just to draw your attention to the Y scale here on this graph, they are, we're talking about mechanical recycling down here below 1 kilogram CO2 per kilogram plastic, whereas these guys are in the 50 to 100. And this is, of course, not talking about the significant other emissions such as toxics in both air and water emissions associated. So putting this all back together, if the goal at the end of this, as Lynn often reminds me, is protecting human health and the planet, for recycling, that really means we need to be displacing the use of that virgin feedstock and not causing more harm than the systems we already have. So looking across these processes, there are really only a few that meet that criteria. So we can see purification in theory meets this criteria because you're recovering that plastic. I will say this one is the least developed and is not really being thought of at scale. You also have to think through the consequences of using all of that chemical solvent. We have mechanical recycling, which we are currently using, and we have reuse, which we know we need to build out to really meet our sustainable economy goals. The last thing I'll talk about is just the policy questions that come up with chemical recycling a lot. Jessica was going to speak to this, so I'm just doing a really quick overview here. But there's three main policy questions that come up a lot in chemical recycling so far. The first is whether these technologies should be regulated as incineration. So specifically these conversion technologies that are using heat and pressure under the Clean Air Act. And there was a recent EPA decision that decided to regulate or maintain pyrolysis as being regulated as incineration under the Clean Air Act. The second is how these facilities should be permitted and regulated, whether they should be manufacturing versus solid waste management. This has a lot of implications in terms of where they can be sited and the types of permits and emissions thresholds associated with the facilities. So 25 states so far have passed laws to reclassify chemical recycling facilities as manufacturing as opposed to solid waste management. And then really the big one is that definition of recycling. The industry is trying to push to include chemical recycling in definitions across the country in state EPR bills, in federal bills, and increasingly as we move towards this international legally binding instrument or treaty to end plastic pollution. So my takeaway here is, what problem are we actually trying to solve? We talked a lot about the challenges with recycling today, from plastics driving the climate crisis to the surge in single-use plastics, design requirements, collection, contamination, responsible end markets. And if we think back, chemical recycling isn't addressing any of these issues. So what problem are we really solving when it comes to chemical recycling? And with that, I will turn it back over to Jordana for Q&A.
Thank you both, Anya and Lynn. The instructions for asking questions are on your screen. Again, you can also pop questions into the Q&A or the chat if you would prefer that we feed those in anonymously. I am not seeing questions at this moment, so I'm gonna kick us off. Anya, you just mentioned briefly the the Global Plastics Treaty. Can you talk a little bit more about how chemical recycling has entered that arena and what we can expect to see there?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we are negotiating a treaty to end plastic pollution. And as part of that, we are going to talk about how we manage, collect, manage, and recycle plastics. So we know that has to be part of the solution to preventing pollution. We've seen this come up in other international agreements that deal with plastic waste in the past, specifically the Basel Convention. And even earlier this year, at the Basel Convention COP in Geneva, we saw a really heated debate and discussion about whether chemical recycling should be considered environmentally sound management. And that sounds super jargony, but that's basically saying like this is an environmentally sound way to manage the end of life of this product. And we ended in a stalemate. Chemical recycling was included in the technical guidelines and in the annex, both in brackets, which is really like international treaty way of saying we could not agree, we're stuck. And if that continues to be the case, which I imagine it will be, there's really strong positions on both sides that are fighting for this. It could really hold up the entire treaty process. And unfortunately, we know that our ocean and the communities that depend on it really cannot afford to wait. But Lynn, you might have more to add on the treaty. Awesome.
I'm actually going to, I see we have a question, a raised hand in the chat. I do want to keep with the theme of this question though. We had a question come in from Jordan Woolman at Politico. I'm going to read it out loud. It's related again to the plastics treaty. How high of a priority is chemical recycling for industry at the Global Plastics Treaty? And what is your assessment of the appetite for diplomats to include chemical recycling as a valid means of end-of-life treatment for plastics and mass balance too, for that matter?
Great questions. I think this is among the top priorities for industry, because essentially, as we just learned, chemical recycling does not recover plastic. That means that we remain dependent on virgin fossil fuel-based plastic to replace that product. So this is their way of getting their cake and eating it too, if you think about it. They get recycled content credit, and that comes back to that mass balance question, which I'll address in a second. And they get to keep doing what they're already doing, which is making virgin fossil fuel-based plastics. So this is kind of life and death for their industry, which is why at the treaty, their two biggest priorities are making sure there's not any globally binding reduction on plastics, which we know is absolutely critical to actually address this issue. And the second would be making sure that chemical recycling can count as recycling, especially if there is any reduction targets, so that they can keep using plastics as a lifeline for the fossil fuel industry. Mass balance is, and Lynn, feel free to jump in here because you might also be better able to explain this one. But mass balance is kind of a bookkeeping way of tracking what you're recycling. So for mechanical recyclers, you know what bales are coming in and you know the amount of resin pellets that you're putting out the door. You can calculate your yield and your loss based on that. There is always a little bit of loss in the recycling process. And then that resin goes somewhere and gets used as recycled content. That's what gets reported on a water bottle that says made with X% recycled content. For chemical recycling, you are not getting plastic back. So how do you try to capture the credit if you want to use that for credit? And so there's this mass balance accounting where you can measure what's going into the system and use that as recycling credit coming out, even if you're not recovering all of that as plastic, even if you're not recovering any of that as something that can be made into plastic. And so that's really that mass balance issue, which is really just the boring bookkeeping of why they're so interested in this chemical recycling.
Boring bookkeeping, but so critical. I think we've learned in the last decade, and for anyone who follows recycling in general, there was the national sword. There's been a lot of moments where the curtain's really been pulled back on recycling in general, and we're recognizing we were measuring success in the wrong place. You really can't, we don't recycle anything at our facility. We collect it and sort it. Nothing is recycled until it's turned into a new product and it's used as a feedstock that's displacing virgin material. And so I think that's where that it seems in the weeds and it's something to easily overlook, but that kind of those kind of criteria and metrics and accounting is really, really critical. The other thing I would say, I would just add about the conversation in terms of all the stakeholders on the treaty is that it's challenging because there are problems with plastics recycling as it exists to solve. And a lot of what many of the chemical recycling proposed projects are promising they are really important. We need to figure out how to get the toxics out of plastics. Our view is that we need to stop putting toxics in there in the first place, right? But I think that, purification and some other technologies, rather than melting down and reaggregating all those perfumes and dyes and toxics and sending them back out into the world as a playground or any other recycled plastic product, the opportunity to remove some of those toxics is an important innovation to pursue. What's missing so far are those important transparent metrics of, what are the inputs, what are the outputs, and what are the actual impacts. The technology might have the opportunity to solve for some of those, but it's so far not yet at scale or at in practice, demonstrating that it's solving any of the other issues that Anya laid out in her slides. So it's they've got a good sales pitch, I guess is what I would say. And so it's a challenge for stakeholders to stay clear about what's, what to negotiate here.
All right, thank you. We're going to go to Cheryl, who I think raised her hand at the very, very beginning. And so thank you for your patience, Cheryl. You, I believe, will be unmuted in a moment. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Cheryl Hogue, and I am representing the Society of Environmental Journalists. I'm working on a piece for them. And Anya, you talked briefly about state laws to include chemical recycling in the definition of recycling. Could you talk a little bit more about that and the sorts of push that's going on with that, and whether that's concurrent with the work on chemical recycling as considered manufacturing facilities? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I can start, and then Lynn, I know you have thoughts on this as well. So one of the big pushes that we're seeing at the state level right now is to pass extended producer responsibility laws. So these are laws that help finance improvements in the recycling system by holding polluters, in this case, the producers of all this packaging, financially accountable for helping invest in our recycling system. So finally getting our recycling system a dedicated, sustainable source of funding to really make some of these improvements and tackle some of the challenges that Lynn's been bringing up. Part of that is establishing targets. How do you know if it's working? How do you know if you need to improve or make changes? And so a very common target in these laws is recycling rates. Great, we want to have X% recycling rate. Awesome. Then we need to define or what we are going to specifically measure. So where are we measuring it and what counts? So to Lynn's point, we don't want to measure at the point of collection, which is what we have been doing time and time again. Measuring what's coming into a MRF does not mean you're being recycled. We need to measure what's coming out of a processing facility as new recycled content that could be used in the manufacturing. And then what is counting? So in that definition of recycling, we need to be sure that we're putting enough bootstraps around that so that we are measuring the type of recycling we want. And that really drives the investment in these extended producer responsibility systems. So I can speak to the bill that we helped write in California, in which chemical recycling does not count as recycling in that system. And there's Not only is it not in the definition, it's not allowed for investments or other pieces of that bill. Oregon, my home state, took a slightly different approach where it establishes a very high burden of proof. So it defines mechanical recycling and then chemical recycling as anything that's not that. And to invest in anything that's not mechanically recycling, you have to demonstrate improvements to greenhouse gas emissions, toxics, and other harms and environmental outcomes versus mechanical recycling. So that's just 2 of the 4 states that have passed laws on this already. Lynn, I know you're working on very similar things right now.
Yeah, you said it as well as I could, Anya. I think that's exactly the critical piece around this definition, the definition section of any legislation or any bill. What are we pointing to and what are we measuring? Goes all the way back to what's our common understanding of what we're defining as recycling, and that risk that Anya talked about in terms of the mass balance is the traceability of what's actually happening to the materials out of most of these technologies is near impossible to really measure success, and to weigh lots of opportunity to cloak what's actually happening. So until that's solved for, our view is that it doesn't belong in definitions of recycling.
All right, thank you both. A question that came through in the chat. This is from North Carolina Health News. I don't know if the journalist wants me to share their name, so I won't. How do we bring plastic manufacturers into this conversation? Most agree that we can't recycle our way out of the plastics pollution problem, so it seems that manufacturers need to produce less plastics.
Yes, I have a point of view on that. I'm sure you do too, Anya. I think we've seen a lot of interesting initiatives that are pre-competitive and are voluntary. We've seen corporate commitments responding to new consumer pressure, and there's just a general awareness, I think, of the intersection between consumption and the climate crisis and human health, and plastics is a real entry point for a lot of people for that. And so, I think that I think the headline is going to be that voluntary efforts just don't work. I think that we're finding that we need regulation, we need policy to level the playing field. I think an interesting related anecdote is that it's always kind of an eye-opener for us when we talk to brands and let them know that we can't sort by brand. So even if you, as a super responsible toothpaste brand, wants to redesign your packaging to technically be out of recyclable plastic, remove toxins, do all the things, right? Even if we can sort it and it could go to one of our markets, we can't educate by brand. We can't put out a guide to residents that says, only Joe's toothpaste this month. And, of course, we can't even get people not to put shoes in their recycling bin. So we really have to focus our efforts there. But then secondly, we're sorting 400 tons a day. I'd say this is another plug. If you haven't been into a recycling facility, try to get on a tour, come to Minneapolis, we'll take you through. But it really is eye-opening in terms of the scale. And while we have some automation, it's certainly not sophisticated enough to sort by brand. And we're not, the cost for labor to do that is astronomical. So brands can't solve this on their own. It has to be by packaging category. And really, the voluntary efforts, if it's not supported through regulation, we've seen time and time again making commitments about using recycled content or redesigning packaging, but then that very rarely trickles down to action by procurement or design, especially in some of these bigger companies. So I think that to get them involved, we need to write good policy. What do you think, Anya?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think we've within the last maybe 5 to 10 years seen an increasing wedge or divide between the plastic users and the plastic makers. And those are, we often talk about industry and paint it with a pretty broad brushstroke, but we've seen a pretty big divide between those two types of industry. The plastic users, the folks who are using that plastic to sell us goods, products, packaging, see the PR nightmare that is single-use plastics. They're feeling the pressure and feeling the pain thanks to the great work of journalists like all of you who are reporting on this. And they want to change. They want to use more recycled content. They want to switch to alternative materials. I think what Lynn was speaking to at the end there is to a point. And it's to a dollar cent, really. When the rubber meets the road, if it's cost prohibitive to source recycled content or use recycled content, they're going to back off and go with the cheaper option, which is virgin plastic. And that's really where policy can come in and ensure that their voluntary efforts are held with the force of law. And that's really what we need. I think we've also seen that to get good legislation passed, we need everyone at the table weighing in, and we need industry buy-in in that process. No one's going to get everything they want out of that process, but it's much better to have them bought in and part of the legislative process than kicking and screaming and fighting and going to courts and suing over legislation. You know, if our goal is to have near-term actionable, measurable reduction and changes in the system, we actually do need industry buy-in. And that means involving them in this legislative process such that they are set up to succeed under these new policies we're coming up with.
To that point, Anya, I would maybe add that I think also a lot of the value in the U.S. Plastics Pact and other stakeholder spaces are getting really clear. We need engagement around what's the low-hanging fruit. Plastics is so complex, the array of packaging, and for brands, there are real challenges and needs around food safety and, all of those aspects to keep their product, I can't think of the right word. Keep it good. That's all I can think of.
Fresh.
Keep it safe. Keep it fresh. There we
Yeah.
go. Right. But so there's lots of really critical considerations and reasons that making choices around packaging. But then there are also lots of extraneous packaging. There's lots of packaging that only serves a marketing function. It's not really a functional, critical piece. And so sorting through that, and so we can really target effective, taking big bites out of the apple where it's easy to do, where there are ready alternatives, where there's drop-in solutions, or we could just get rid of it. We do need experts in packaging and design and food safety to help us figure out what are the trickier nuts to crack, what are the things that we can just get rid of now. And I think we're seeing lots more sophisticated policy and strategy written around that, and I think we'll continue to see more.
Absolutely.
All right, we've got at least something like 4 to 6 more questions in the chat. So I'm going to do my best to get to them in the 10 minutes we have left. Reminder that contact information for the panelists will be up at the end. Everyone is welcome to reach out with follow-up questions, of course. So going mostly in chronological order here, Mary Catherine O'Connor asked, what's your take on using chemical recycling for textiles? Startups are gaining traction here given the volume of polyester material and the inability to recycle it mechanically. Startups are generally not using pyrolysis for this, but rather depolymerization.
I'm certainly not an expert in that arena, but I do know enough to know that the complexities of textile recycling and the real abject failure of the reuse, especially on the global south and other frontline communities. So I think it is a place we need innovation. There's not existing technology or systems to handle the clothes that continue to be more and more made out of plastic and mixed materials. And so I don't know yet if anything is to scale, and I don't know enough to speak to the inputs and outputs and those impacts, but I do know that textiles seems like a important arena to be focusing some of the innovation, because there's not a lot of solutions available now.
Yeah, absolutely. I think much like the single-use plastics and packaging we're talking a lot about today, the first clear bite at the apple needs to be, oh my gosh, we're making too many clothes. Fast fashion is absolutely exploded, and we are making far more than we can manage, even if we bring online all of the fancy technologies. So that's obviously the first, and that's the exact same story you'll hear with single-use plastic packaging. The second is that, fortunately, clothes are made out of, tend to be made out of a much smaller subset of plastic. So these polyesters, those polyesters are the type of condensation polymer we talked about. So they are easier to work with in some of these technologies, both purification and depolymerization. Now, for any technology that's going to recycle plastics, it needs to displace virgin content and lead to improved environmental and human health outcomes. I don't know which startups these are and if they're meeting those criteria, but I think those are the right criteria to be measuring in any application. It is really what we want policies to set about in place. I think the last thing that I would add that we just haven't talked quite as much about yet is transparency. The use of these broad terms, chemical recycling, molecular recycling, all of those really do obscure what's going on. These websites, I don't know if you've ever gone to one for these companies, but they tell you absolutely nothing. They don't tell you about yield, outputs, other toxics, what they're doing with solvents. And really, it puts communities and policymakers at a disadvantage to be able to understand and properly regulate these types of facilities. So I do think there is potential there. As Lynn was saying, if you're measuring against the best alternative, there is no best alternative for these clothes right now. It's burying or burning. So, you do have a bar there, but we need to be really open and transparent about the whole system, like we are with a lot of our other recycling processes, so we can make those informed decisions.
I'm going to use my moderator powers to segue to a question that was in the chat, a little bit out of order here, but that's relevant to what you just said, Anya.
Yeah.
Are there any known impacts of chemical recycling to frontline communities?
Yeah. Short answer. I mean, absolutely. There are known impacts from all recycling facilities to frontline communities. We also know that these types of facilities are disproportionately cited in low income, predominantly minority and other frontline communities. It is not a coincidence. So the air emissions, water emissions, there are a lot of implications that come from these types of facilities, and that, how they get permitted and regulated, what transparent information we're able to access, and what they're telling the communities surrounding them are all critically important to making sure that we're able to hold these facilities and their operators accountable to the community, and actually, living up to human health standards.
What she said. Got it.
Okay, great. We've got 5 minutes to go. I'm going to combine these two somewhat related questions. One is from Jordan Woolman at Politico. We have any sense where things stand on chemical recycling in the context of the FTC's Green Guides review? Things seem to have been quiet from the FTC on this since they held a recyclability workshop a few months ago. And sort of relatedly, from Megan Quinn at Waste Dive, looking at legislation and policy in the US, what trends do you think will come up in the coming year or so related to regulation of chemical recycling beyond the ACC-backed bills, reclassifying it as manufacturing? So FTC and legislative trends.
Anya, do you want to speak to FTC first?
Yeah, I have no idea. They're being
Okay.
pretty over there. They're years behind where they should be and do not seem to be in a rush to make up for that. I am happy to see them take their time and get this right, but I have no idea where things stand with that update.
You could also probably speak to the policy trends better than I think the one thing we're watching again is there's a lot of recycling legislation moving, everything from post-consumer content requirements to EPR to bottle bills. And all of these are one of their foundational pieces is a definition of recycling and recyclability. And so how this gets designed in or designed out, or burdens of proof built around these technologies will be really pivotal, and they're moving in all kinds of states. I think over the next year, we're seeing a lot of momentum around that.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. The other piece that I am keeping my eye out on is legislation similar to what we introduced in Oregon earlier this year. That's, placing temporary moratoriums or restrictions on the building of new facilities, either full stop or barring more environmental reviews of the facilities. So really the proactive push from legislatures around the country to get a better handle on what the impacts of these facilities are before they allow them to continue to be built in their state.
Awesome. I think this might be the last question that I have seen. There's a lot of activity. This is from Elise Hauser. I hope I'm saying that correctly. Could enzymatic or biological recycling offer a viable alternative to chemical recycling, or do these run up against the same issues?
I think they all run into a lot of the same issues. So you might not be burning it with, conversion technologies. You're potentially getting back to a monomer. If you're talking about depolymerization enzymatically, you still need an incredibly pure feedstock. It only works for certain plastics. And we need to be able to collect and invest and get all of those things. Right now, the scale of all of those technologies is slow. Like, it is nowhere where it needs to be if it's going to be even a drop in the bucket of kind of tackling the amount of waste we make and produce every single day. So while it has some advantages potentially over, these more chemical-based ones, we don't know, we haven't seen anything even at pilot scale to measure the impacts of those types of technologies to really measure if it's overall better. And ultimately, a lot of the plastics that have been proven effective so far in those technologies are things like PET. We can mechanically recycle PET. We just need to do a better job collecting it and cleaning it and separating it from other things. So again, it comes back to what problem are we really solving by investing in that technology?
Okay, well, dang, we're good. We've got less than a minute to go, so I think we're at time. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Ocean Conservancy has a fact sheet about chemical recycling on our website. If you go to oceanconservancy.org/plasticsfacts. But please do not hesitate to reach out with additional questions. The contact information is on the screen. Take a screenshot, reach out to me. We can also send the recording around. So with that, have a great rest of your week. Thanks again.